Hello, everyone. This is the Vice President of Internet Infidels, Edouard Tahmizian. I also have a scholarly article that was accepted for publication about 2 years ago on the origin of evil and theistic hard determinism. And today we'll be going down in the history books because I have the great, enormous pleasure of interviewing both the legendary mimetic expert, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, and the most beautiful Dr. Robyn Walsh, who is an assistant professor at Miami University. And before you begin talking amongst yourselves, I'll let you add to your introduction and talk about upcoming works or anything else that you like. And then I'll just let you all take the conversation however you see fit.
Robyn, you want to go first?
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me to do that. So I'm Robyn Walsh. I'm an associate professor at University of Miami down here in Coral Gables, where we're about to get a hurricane from everything that I'm learning this morning. I know. Most recently, I just grabbed the book because I thought that was a good suggestion that you had for me to do that. Most recently published with Cambridge University Press, The Origins of Early Christian Literature. And most recently, I'm working on book 2, which is called Popularizing Jesus. And one of the problems that I'm working on in that book is trying to figure out, can I demonstrate that elite authors outside of the ambit of early Christianity, especially in the 2nd century, are actually reading early Christian texts and sort of satirizing them. In some cases, that's obvious, like Lucian, but I'm looking for evidence that it's happening in other places. So I'm also working on a project on Paul and the moon, which I'm waiting to get some more feedback on, but thinking about Paul as a Middle Platonic philosopher and what he thinks the role of the moon is, and his afterlife imaginings. So that's pretty much where I'm at in my most recent scholarship. So I'll hand things over to Dennis.
Thank you, Dr. Robyn Walsh. All right, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, it's all on you.
Robyn Walsh is a relatively newly minted scholar. I'm not a newly minted scholar. Actually, I've been retired for 6 years, though I still am very active as a scholar. And publication, I published over a dozen books, and the work I'm doing now is the most important, Edward. It's called Synopsis of Epic Tragedy in the Gospels. And it not only is an English translation of all of the New Testament Gospels, including much of the Acts of the Apostles, but it also includes an English translation of my reconstruction of Q and lengthy introductions when appropriate to imitations of classical Greek poetry, such as Homer and Euripides. And this is one of the places where Robyn and I have common cause. That is, the Gospels are not written by fishermen. They're not uneducated. They are working inside of a kind of game that the ancients played in integrating stories or imagining or imitating stories of recognized literary successes in order to reshape their own social identities by creating foundational narratives. Now, I want to clarify something. I don't care to be called an atheist, though I certainly am one. I'd rather be understood to be a humanist who's theoskeptical. And I actually think that makes more sense. I also am not a theologian. For me, theology is just a long 4-letter word. And I'm not really a historian. I consider myself more of a philologian who's trying to understand how texts work with each other and what issues into a rewriting of an earlier text. And I cut my teeth on this, not on the Gospels, but on Christian apocryphal texts, where I had to edit and create a best version by using Greek, Latin, sometimes Armenian and Anglo-Saxon and Syriac sources in order to reconstruct texts. And in doing so, I realized that talking about oral tradition makes no sense whatsoever in understanding the textuality of these texts. And I tried to use some of those techniques on apocryphal literature, and it failed miserably. But what I learned is that the literary tasks of understanding intertextuality among Christian apocrypha illumines what's going on in the Gospels. So the direction goes the opposite direction. So Robyn, I was a student of Helmut Kester, and Kester was Rudolf Bultmann's last student. And I had an NEH grant to study at Indiana University in the Folklore Institute, and realized that the Acts of Andrew and some of these other apocryphal texts that I was working with have no antecedent oral tradition whatsoever. To understand their textuality is to understand how intellectuals rewrote antecedent texts in order to articulate what we would call their theologies, but they probably would understand as their social ideologies. So anyway, that's more than you wanted to hear from me right away out of the chutes, Edward. But
no, it was perfect.
I wanted to be clear. I'm not a theologian. I don't want to change anybody's religion. What I want to change is their stupidity and their ignorance. And I think religion is always going to be better when it's rooted in some kind of intelligent discourse than it is in posturing and appealing to divine revelation and so on. Robyn, I don't know how you would respond to that, but.
Well, it's interesting. I did know that you were a visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School at one point. I didn't realize you were also Helmut Kester student, because I was also Helmut Kester student, but at the end of his career.
Oh, is that right?
I was his research assistant when I was at HDS. And actually a good portion of the book that I published on origins of early Christian literature was inspired by being utterly confused by his insistence on oral tradition theory, and also the way he basically anything he didn't like about Paul, he said was an interpolation. And so that led me to want to look at the influence that I saw in German Romanticism on the field, in terms of imagining communities authoring texts, which allows certain claims about, fishermen, as you put it, being able to actually record down oral histories, even though what we actually have in the Gospels, and you've alluded to this with your introduction, is highly refined literature that is based on pre-existent literature, inspired by that literature, informed by it.
That's right.
Working within genre classifications that are well-defined. And not the sort of sui generis kind of, like oral tradition just being recorded by communities. And so that was really what I went, forward trying to disprove, in part because of my experience trying to conform to the ideas of oral tradition, interpolation, and the exceptionalism of early Christianity. So I spent a lot of time trying to deconstruct that in my own scholarship now.
When I was at the Folklore Institute at Indiana University, I worked with a woman named Linda Dake, who's a specialist on the brothers Grimm. And of course, the brothers Grimm, and you mentioned this in your second chapter, were inspired by what you call German Romanticism and Das Volk and so on. She helped me realize that in these texts I was looking at, there was no oral tradition. It's not coming out of that kind of romanticism and let's get the folklore and then we'll know what the woman telling a story to children in the next village is all about. It's rather how intellectuals are recasting other literature in order to serve new purposes.
Awesome.
Yeah, and also sorry, do you want to say
Go
something?
ahead, Rob. The floor is yours.
I was just going to say, I worked on the Brothers Grimm in part because my editor at Cambridge told me that they were great uncles of hers or something along the great uncles. And I thought, well, I have to include, yes, I have to include them. So they weren't originally part of that chapter, but I realized they became a good representation of the methodology that I was trying to demonstrate, in part too, because they weren't reclaiming the lost narratives of the German folk. They were actually just talking to rich friends or making things up on their own. And so they were elites fantasizing about what the common stories for the German people would be. And that's very much a nationalistic and political project, in addition to a literary one, but it has very little to do with the common people.
Yeah, the same things with Chasson de Roland. Yeah, for the French. At some point, I think it'd be helpful to hear each other describe the differences between us, not as an argument. I'm not a debater.
Me either.
So the issue is, I think your experience and background, and by the way, we all could talk about David Constant, who's
also another one of my teachers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And what I consider an ally and a classicist and a really fine gentleman. I mean, he's a beautiful man. But I'd be willing to start out by saying what I perceive as your intellectual commitments, and it's okay for you to say the same to mine, and where the rub might be or where we'd encourage a difference. So you can go first if you want to.
It's a bit of a daunting task. I mean, to me, the part of your, many academic achievements that I've found very compelling and I cite in my own book is your work on Homer. And I don't say this as a comparison to, perhaps a bit of an intellectual genealogy now that I know you also worked with Hector, but Mimi Palmer Bonds. Did you ever know Marianne Palmer Bonds? She had a book on Luke Axe's epic that came out, I would say probably.
Oh, yes, yeah, absolutely. I use her a lot.
Yeah, and so I thought of your work on Homer a bit in that tradition, although she pulls some punches, I think, and that was her dissertation under Hector at Harvard. But this idea that the early Christians, if that's what we want to call them for the sake of simplicity in this conversation, are trying to establish their own foundational epic. Sometimes I wonder how we can basically kind of how do we view that in light of what we might imagine as the cohesion of this movement in its earliest form? So, when do we want to date the Gospels? How much do we see them actually self-consciously trying to establish a foundational epic for themselves? Is it purely a necessity of genre, or is it something that makes more of a statement about the cohesion of what we might imagine the early Christian groups? And so that's always something that I'm interested in looking at that line between understanding the literary constraints that these authors face, but what it represents in terms of a social reality. So that's one thing I would love to talk to you more about, especially comparing the epics and how much we also think that might say something about the early Christian authors' education and their social location. So the idea of social location as it relates to that kind of comparative effort is something I'm really interested in, not being content to just say these are foundational epics, because I wish that Palmer Bonds had pushed that a little bit more in her work as well. But I haven't really seen more people work on this in the field. And so I think it's something incredibly important. And so I'm just interested in just learning more from you. But I wonder what you would say about social location.
Okay. Well, some of my students have actually pressed it, but are having difficulty getting their dissertations published because there's resistance to this.
Right.
And I think the reason that Marianne Palmer Bonds did not push further was because of Helmut and the Harvard climate at the time that was resistant to literary dependence of one book on another.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the critique by Stefan Krauta? It's Virgil's Evangeliums.
No.
And Virgil's Gospel. It's in German. It's a brilliant article, and it's awful. But it's by a classicist who really, like many classicists, bristle at the thought that Jews or Christians would know enough Homer or Plato or Euripides in order to pull this off and expect the readers to do so. And he wrote a really unfair, in my view, article criticizing bonds. And I've got a detailed response to Crowder in this new book that's coming out. But his objection was actually mine in a way. I think Marianne Palmer de Bonds did not go far enough in comparing actual narratives in the Gospels and in Virgil. And I'm going to give you several examples that I think are so stellar that we really have to take them seriously. One is Virgil has his own version of the story of Polyphemus. Aeneas goes and he finds a Greek or an Achaean who is left on the island. And unlike Odysseus, who blinds him and steals his stuff, Aeneas takes his enemy aboard ship and honors him with protection. So this is the syncresis. That is, Aeneas is not the jerk that Odysseus is. The death of Turnus at the end of the Aeneid clearly is based on the death of Hector at the end of the Iliad. And that's also the model that gets used in the Gospel of Mark. So there are a number of, in Luke Acts, for example, why not compare in detail the shipwreck of Odysseus in Odyssey 5 and the shipwreck of Aeneas in Aeneid 1? And I've found 20 overlapping analogous imitations. And just so that your viewers, Edward, understand this, we're talking about a book that was finished 70 years before the earliest extant gospel, that is the Gospel of Mark. So, and by that time, the Aeneid had become the most important foundational literature of the Roman Empire. And when social groups went, including Romans themselves, went to reevaluate their social identities, they often did so in poetry, imitating the Aeneid, and occasionally in prose. So I think Bonds and John Taylor and others are right on target in claiming that there's a similarity between the Acts of the Apostles and the Aeneid. I actually think it goes into the Gospels as well. But I think Crowder's criticism is fair. They didn't press the material far enough. This is where I think being a philologian makes more sense than being a general a theorist about ancient literature. One of the things that I was missing a little bit, Robyn, in your work was more explicit work with the rhetoricians, Quintilian, Libanius, and the like. Is that something you're interested in pursuing, or that you've worked on and just didn't put in the book?
Yeah, I was trying to keep the book a little, they actually had me remove 2 different chapters. So the book dealt with more, but I had to make it a little bit more discreet in its argumentation just to kind of get it through the editorial juggernaut. These kind of things have to go through. I am interested in these questions. And actually, I wrote down a couple of things to ask you to sort of follow up to what you just said that might relate to your question to me, which is back to this idea of the foundational epic, but also the idea of the way that the gospel writers may defer to Homer or to even Virgil in terms of craft. So I wanted to ask you, do you think the gospel writers have read Virgil? Because I actually see in something like the Gospel of Mark a great deal of emulation of what we might consider, the paragons of literary craft in the ancient world with Homer and with Virgil. But I don't know how to resolve the question of whether or not we have these Greek writers reading Latin. So I was just curious what you think about that as one.
Are you familiar with the work of Chris Shea?
Shea?
Shea, yeah, she's a classicist, and she is an expert really on mimesis as well. And she thinks that the kind of boundaries that we've had, walls we've built between Greek and Latin competence is unfortunate.
Yeah.
I would have a more nuanced understanding of this. I think Mark has occasionally Latin words, and the name that's given to the gospel is Marcus, which is of course a Latin name. But the language play is not with Latin, but it's with Semitic languages.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have transcriptions in some cases, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, Talitha Kumi, Dalmanutha probably is an Aramaic name, and it goes on and on. So I think the issue for Mark of linguistic competence is tricky. I think what Mark is doing, writing after the Jewish War, and you agree with that piece of it, is aware, apparently, of Virgil, and is aware that Virgil has imitated Homer, and now he's going to have his own analogous imitations. Mm-hmm. But I don't see sufficient markers to say that the version, let's say the Polyphemus story that he's working with comes from Virgil. It comes from Homer, in my view. But Luke is a different story.
Yeah.
And Luke has more Latinisms. His name too, of course, is Latin and not Greek. And there are a number of places where I think one can say with relative confidence that he's aware of and probably has read some Latin. The fact that scholars frequent, however one dates Luke, and I think you date Luke Acts earlier than I do, but whenever one dates it, it is either part of the second sophistic or it's anticipating the second sophistic. And it's been shown by Tim Whitmarsh and others that the second sophistic was clearly bilingual Greek-Latin authors. But because these are Hellenophiles, and even though they may have positions in the Roman administration, they prefer writing in Greek, and they prefer having their literary models being Plato or Homer or whatever. So I think there's, so my long answer to you, and I apologize for going on.
No, I have lots to say though after.
Is that I think with Luke Acts, we're permitted to have more of an appreciation of bilingualism.
So the one thing I kind of want to return to Mark for a moment, again, with your question to me in mind, I do talk about quintillion a little bit in my book, but I do back off a little because I was struggling at the time of writing this book with that question. Exactly how can I locate these authors in terms of imagining their education beyond just a basic sort of paideia? And so as time has gone on, I lean more in the direction that I agree that our lines between Greek and Latin and imagining what writers in the ancient world would have been exposed to in the course of their training. And somebody at the literary level of even Mark, I definitely agree that his mastery of Greek is actually better than people give him credit for.
Yeah.
I happen to believe that Mark is reading Paul because I don't think you can understand how things like pneuma and dunamis, so spirit and power and the healing miracles in Mark function unless you understand a Middle Platonic idea or a Stoic idea of the functioning of those substances in the ancient world. So I think Mark is employing that or deploying it the same way that we see Paul doing. And I think that the idea that Paul is well aware of Platonic and Stoic ideas is beyond dispute, personally. But I'm also coming from, the school of Stan Stowers as well, where that's pretty well established, that Paul is a Middle Platonist. So I would put Mark maybe in that tradition, but where I struggle somewhat is how much more credit do I want to give Mark? And personally, I've been working on a question I didn't mention in my introduction, but I'm about to publish a piece on the idea that Mark maybe is aware of Virgil insofar as what we tend to call the Messianic Secret, this idea that nobody knows who Jesus is, everybody's sort of dumbfounded when they see him, all of the eyewitnesses. I just gave a paper for the Next Quest conference that took place, the third wave of the Next Quest, that took place this summer, on the idea that what we have traditionally called the Messianic Secret is actually just the way that Virgil deploys thalma or thalmata and encodes eyewitnesses in his own text. So the example I give is Camilla. Nobody knows who she is. She rides in, people are dumbfounded, they're awestruck, they're confused. They don't know, how to basically take in what they're seeing. She comes in, she leaves, and everybody asks, who was that? We don't understand who that was. The being overcome by the mystery or the wonder that they've just encountered. I think Mark is doing the same thing. And so it's an interesting challenge for me to try to, and one that I think you would be sympathetic to, how do you convey this idea that you see that kind of literary relationship, that you see Mark deploying the way that thalma is sometimes used in texts like Virgil to indicate that this is something that awestruck eyewitnesses, so therefore as a reader you should be awestruck by this, and that's a literary device or a literary technique that you use in this kind of writing, not a literal description of what happened when Jesus was walking around Galilee. Do you see what I mean there?
Why not? Okay, I'm going to come at it somewhat differently, but as a Platonic Socratic questioner.
Okay.
Why do you think the Virgil secrecy, which appears, and so your viewers know thalma means amazement, right?
Yeah. Or wonder.
Wonder, yeah.
Gotcha.
Why would that be a more compelling model to you than Odysseus keeping his identity a secret at the end of the Odyssey?
That's one instance, right? Where people don't recognize who he is at the end of the Odyssey.
Oh, it goes from from book 13 to 22.
I liked the confusion. I guess, yeah, I would have to look at the language, certainly, but that is a good corollary to think. What I wanted to get at is the way that we approach eyewitnesses in the gospel is to actually reconstruct something about the historical Jesus. But I think eyewitnesses included in the text, yeah, it doesn't just have to be Virgil, it can be Homer. It was more or less seeing the way that Camilla is, just again, as an example from Virgil, comes in, goes out, and the confusion that results from the eyewitnesses. But I suppose Odysseus could be just as good a model, and one that probably Virgil's relying on as well, right?
Well, in addition to thalma, or wonder, as you say, we have the issue of semea, that is signs. And what happens is one's in the world, in the epic world, and you stumble across someone, and all of a sudden you see that they can walk on water, or all of a sudden you see that they can string the bow, or all of a sudden you see that they vanish into thin air. So these semea, these signs, then often issue in amazement, and there are a number of words that one can use for that. And another Greek word that's used in tragedy for that is anagonismus, that is the recognition. And so people, deities or heroes get recognized because they do something spectacular. That's the sign. And you have equivalents of that in Virgil. And Camel is a good example where he or she rides in on a horse and she can kick butt against the Trojans as much as she wants to. And by the way, I'm not talking about the new Queen Camilla.
The consort. Well, actually, can I ask you a quick question? Because I should have reread my Homer before talking to you today. But the thing I like about the Camilla example, again, she rides in. It's an inversion of expectation as well.
That's right.
She's a woman.
Yeah.
And also the way that people are amazed to the point of almost losing their minds when they see her. They're completely dumbfounded, and there isn't necessarily resolution in those scenes at all to what they've just taken in. It's almost too overwhelming. The signs that they're seeing are too overwhelming for them to comprehend. That was the part that I really liked about Virgil's depiction, because what we call the Messianic Secret, obviously the key to that in the gospel is that there isn't resolution to who he is actually. Not until chapter 8 do you even have somebody sort of peg who this guy might actually be, right? So that kind of confusion where it leaves everybody in its wake, just sort of dumbfounded. Would you?
That recognition in chapter 8, you're talking about Peter's recognition, I think is based on Eurycleia's recognition of Odysseus. And so on. But let me make a kind of a meta comment about this discussion, Edward. This kind of discussion happens too rarely among biblical scholars, New Testament scholars. And the fact that we have different assessments of an important episode in the Aeneid is really quite exceptional. I think Robyn would agree with that we just don't have discussions like this very much, because we have stovepipes. We have classicists, and by the way, classicism has its own stovepipes, whether it's archaeology or philology or mythology or Roman history or whatever. So we don't talk to each other about interpretations of literature. And I find this very stimulating. And Robyn, I hope this isn't the last time we talk this way.
No, better
but
not.
I think, but it's also fun. And by the way, it's also open-ended. It's not that one person is right or another. It's rather that we are seeing different things that are there. But then the issue is, how do we prioritize them? How do we make sense of them? And so it's this kind of discourse that I think is so absent in so much New Testament scholarship on the Gospels. I think it's a pity. People are willing to do that when it comes to a story about Elijah, but not when it comes to a story about Aeneas.
Awesome. And just to give some quick comments, if you all ever want to do this interview again, you know who to go to. That's for one thing, Freethinker Podcast, First Time in History. Secondly, Robyn, I wanted to give you an opportunity to formally address on social media for the first time in history, briefly, if you'd like, your position on mythicism. Because I know a lot of people I've been interviewing, like John Dominic Crossan and Carrier, they're kind of like a gray area to them. They don't know where to put you in, and nor does Robert M. Price. And I know you told me via email your position, but if you could just give us a little summary on your take on the mythicist position and whether you think it's plausible or not, and why.
So the mythicist position being Jesus never existed.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think he existed. I actually don't. I don't have. Even that I don't have terribly strong. My justification for that is primarily that I find it more implausible to think that I don't think Paul was readily accepted by his own testimony by those in Jerusalem, Peter and James, he names specifically. And I don't see much of a benefit to Paul, assuming that that's genuine to Paul, those claims, making that up. Because it establishes his justification for being what he calls the apostle to the Gentiles. So something was happening in Jerusalem in the wake of this man we call Jesus. And so I think that is an indication that there are too many arguments to say that there was a man named Jesus. Do I think he looks like the gentleman that we have presented to us in the Gospels? No, I do not. Yeah, but I do think he. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. We all know Dennis's position. He just gets machine guns and goes at it. And
I want to do a follow-up question to Robyn about that.
All right, sounds good.
Where do you stand on the existence of Q and its relative reconstructions?
I think there's a very good chance that Q is a great model of the exact kind of romantic thinking that I tried to talk about in the second chapter of my book, in part because it's not just that people suggest that reconstruct Q and suggest that it existed. It's that every single thematic move that happens in Q gets assigned to a community. And it just so happens that those communities can be traced back to an origin story about Christianity. All of that as a project of the 19th century, I think Q fit into that beautifully as a justification model that got then reinforced by the discovery of Thomas, right?
Well,
so
I think that's fair for much of Q scholarship, but it doesn't work for me because I think Q already is a sophisticated document and that it has two models. One is Deuteronomy that is frequently cited, and it's to make Jesus the new prophet like Moses, who was promised in Deuteronomy and was common in Judaism. The other is we have at several points, I think, imitations of the Odyssey to portray Jesus as the suffering. And by the way, he has his own secret in the Q document. So I would say that Q skeptics need to keep in mind two different questions. One is whether there was a Q document. And it sounds to me, Robyn, that you think maybe there was a Q document. The second is, can one reconstruct that document into a text that can be meaningfully read? And my point is that I don't think the author of Q is doing the German romantic thing of, I think he's trying to make a claim against Torah observant Jews that here we have a Jewish hero that's willing to break Torah in order to deal with the socially marginal. So this, I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm trying to say that I think Q scholarship is in a very bad spot right now.
I agree with that.
And I'm trying to find a different way to understand it. But in my view, the Q document already is a sophisticated work of literature.
I was just trying to look up the name of a scholar whose name is escaping me, but I was wondering what you think. There have been some recent movements to suggest that Q is actually a collection, and at least in part, if not entirely, of John the Baptist's sayings. And I was wondering what you think of that.
Well, Claire Rothschild has played.
That's the name. That's what I was trying to remember. Thank you. Yeah.
No, that doesn't work for me for a number of reasons, but that probably is too deep in the weeds.
Okay.
But no, I don't buy it. And Claire's a friend of mine, and I certainly respect her work.
Okay.
Oh, hey, just to make a quick comment, did you guys seem to get the little meme I sent you about the Q hypothesis?
No, I didn't.
Short meme. Oh, okay, you guys are gonna find this funny. So it's a meme, and the title is "German Scholars After They Invented Q." It's the scene from Star Wars where these drug lords are just like, it's like Al Pacino's character. He's just laughing over the phone with this other guy who's a drug dealer, and you just see this money being counted by a money machine with like 80s music playing in the back.
Okay, I'm gonna really say that's naughty. That's naughty.
It's provocative, though. I thought it was hilarious.
Okay, I went to school at Harvard and I taught at Claremont. Those are the two American universities that have been most invested in Q.
Yeah,
and these scholars who have worked on these texts are talented philologians. They are careful, and the whole documented Q series and the other people that have worked on the International Q Project, to have people simply say that's inventing this document is like people saying people just, thought they were inventing penicillin and they didn't. Because to invent penicillin, you have to do serious work. You have hypotheses, you have tests, you have, and this is why I more and more identify myself as a philologian than any kind of historian. I want to know how these texts work. And by the way, as Robyn surely knows with her training in classics, it's not unusual for people to take multiple versions of a text and to try to reconstruct what's missing. You have it in the Platonic letters, for example, or you find it in Latin literature where you have fragments and multiple versions. So Edward, I don't mean to insult you, but I really am angry at people who dismiss the Q hypothesis as though it's people smoking dope. These are people who are philologically sophisticated. Now, in my view, there were two major mistakes that Q scholars made at the beginning. One is that Luke didn't know Matthew. Sure, Luke knew Matthew, and that Mark could not have known Q. Of course, Mark knew Q, and I think one can make solid philological arguments related to it. Now, because of those two flaws, people like Mark Goodacre can come along and say, look at all these overlaps and these minor agreements that we have between Matthew and Luke, and we also have the infancy narratives and yada, yada. Of course, Luke knew Matthew. That doesn't mean that he didn't also know Q. It means that we have to have a different hypothesis and different methodology to tease it out. But this is where people are impatient.
Gotcha. Oh, and just to make a comment, so Jonathan Sheffield knew we were going to be doing an interview today, and he was excited about it too. And he got back with me with a little quick question for you, Dennis. And I think you briefly touched upon it, but if you wanted to elaborate more, feel free. So his question to you is, how does Hector and Achilles parallel to the Gospels?
Achilles and who? Hector?
Yes. How does that parallel to the Gospels?
That is really, I'm going to give you a stupidly simple answer, but I think there's truth behind it.
Okay.
Like Achilles, who knows he's going to die in Troy, but nonetheless is willing to do what he needs to defend his friends and to vindicate himself, vindicate Patroclus, goes courageously to his death. And so I think that's about the best we can do with Achilles. When it comes to Hector, the death of Jesus and the death of Hector are incredible. Hector thinks his gods have abandoned him, and they have. Jesus says on the cross in Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me? 3 women in the Iliad mourn the death of Hector, Hecuba, Andromache, and Helen. You have to then go at night and get the corpse of the dead person, and in this case, Priam getting the corpse of Hector, and then burying him, and so on. The parallels go on and on. I really think they're undeniable. So I think the author of Mark was more attracted to the Hector character than he was to the Achilles character. But he also was attracted to the Odyssean character, keeping secrecy, awaking in a storm, the Polyphemus story, and so on. All right, Robyn, I want to go back to, if you have a response to Q, I'd love to hear it.
I do. Thank you. I was waiting for my chance to interject that. So I wanted to say I agree with you because I have the utmost respect for scholars like John Kloppenborg and Sarah Rollins, who've worked a great deal at the Toronto School, working a great deal on Q.
That's right, too. Yeah.
And actually, I am contributing to the Cambridge Companion on Q. So it's not that I have a position where I just, outwardly dismiss this hypothesis and don't take it seriously. I did actually, one of the chapters that was removed from the book was on Q, in which I tried to argue that you could place Q post-war because you have a Jesus who doesn't need the temple. His teachings do not center on the temple. And so that would shift our traditional dating, even of Q, and the Gospels as a phenomenon of writing that is a post-war phenomenon. So my contention with it is that the way that unfortunately has developed in the field in some circles with this obsession or this focus on individual communities being represented by individual lines of thought in the text, I think has contributed to the same kind of romantic problem that I've identified.
Okay, it depends on your reconstruction of Q. My reconstruction of Q has the temple still in existence.
Okay.
When you go to bring your gift to the altar and your brother, your Adelphos, has something against you, go and be reconciled first and then offer your gift. We also have the business of do not swear by the altar. Do not swear by the sanctuary. This is missing in most versions of Q, but it belongs there in my view. And also the prediction that I will destroy this temple and build another is in my reconstruction of Q. So this is where things get really kind of dicey, don't they, Robyn? Because we have competing reconstructions of Q, and we don't have physical evidence. We simply have textual probabilities that to go on.
Well, although when we could make, actually, let me put it this way. Can we make the same claim about, say, the canonical Gospels, which also imagine a world in which the temple is still standing, even if the majority of Jesus's teachings end up not being centered on temple cult, but the temple still stands?
Well, that's a good point, because especially Matthew still assumes that you've got these rules that you need to have for the temple and so on, but some of those come from Q. But of course, they're telling a story about Jesus who's before the temple, so before the temple destruction. So what choice do they have, actually?
But what choice would the Q author have?
Well, that's a fair point, but I don't think, I think the fact that he's talking about the temple to be destroyed in the future and build another in 3 days, or build another, is more problematic than what you find in the Gospels. Anyway, that's deep in the woods. I know that most viewers aren't going to go there, but anyway, I think the interpretation of Q is badgered by but not by having multiple reconstructions, several of which are plausible, and in my view, mine's most plausible.
Gotcha. All right, and just to ask a quick question about Q. So does the whole Q hypothesis revolve around Mark being the first gospel written?
First of all, Mark surely was the first gospel, so that should actually not even be discussed. But I think you can make an argument for the Q document without having Mark in priority, but then it becomes more difficult. The most important part of the Q hypothesis, in my view, is Luke's reverse priority to both Mark and Matthew. That is, it's almost certain that Luke was written last. Why is it that he has such a repository of sayings that have wording and sequencing that's more primitive than his known sources? So if it's not coming from Mark and it's coming from Matthew, please help me understand where it may be coming from. Now, that can only give you a pile of rocks. It doesn't tell you how the rocks get organized into a wall. And this is one of the places where Q research is problematic. It's one thing to identify traditional material. It's another to find out what sequence they likely were in. So that requires a new set of philological criteria. And of course, that is really deep in the woods. So I know that your people don't need that. But I think Mark in priority is firm. But even as firm, is Luke's reverse priority to his known sources. That stuff comes from somewhere.
Awesome. Thank you. And hey, feel free to go deep in the woods, because I know there's someone out there who's, deep into the scholarly stuff, and they're going to want to know specifics about, your answers to certain questions. So go on ahead. You too, Robyn, if you want to go in, just feel free. There's someone out there who's going to appreciate whatever you guys have to say, whether it briefly touches the end of the iceberg or goes deep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we end, I have another question I really want to ask Robyn.
Oh no.
And this is not a challenge at all. It really is a very soft pitch.
Okay.
I think we are way overdue in talking about pagan and Jewish reception of the Gospels. And I know that you have something going on with the Syricon. We can talk about that. I'm such a fan of Lucian. And Lucian,
me too.
Lucian knows of Christian books. And he knows of Christians that he treats with contempt who are reading these books, including Peregrinus and so on. Yeah. So the fact that, and by the way, I wouldn't be surprised that you have in Apuleius
I agree.
Some echoes. So this really, I think, is a very important, I'm going to use a word I hate, a trump card for you, by saying that we have a reception among intellectuals that are panning or parodying some of these gospel tropes. And the reason I think that helps, or mimesis helps, is some of these tropes are already coming from Homer, but they are mediated through the Gospels into this other literature. So I am a fan of talking about mimetic chains. We have chain reactions where one imitation leads to another, and you find residue of it, I think, in the likes of Petronius, whoever the hell he is, and Robyn knows why I put it that way, and Lucian, and maybe other authors as well.
So I am working on this right now because I think that, well, we have a couple of problems going on. One is back to a little bit of what I said earlier in our conversation, my interest in the social location of these authors, because I've been trying to do a little bit more work trying to reconstruct literary networks, especially in the 2nd century and beyond. Now, I have secure evidence, as you say, Lucian, and I love Lucian as well. I think that if I had come to Lucian at a different point in my life, I wouldn't be doing New Testament. I think I probably would have gone into that field, and especially, obviously, Peregrinus, which as a satire, I think is one of the best satires that we have from the ancient world, in my opinion. I do think that it's possible that Apuleius is aware of Christianity for a number of reasons, and we wouldn't be the first scholars to.
No, that's right. No, that's right.
This has been speculated by people like P.G. Walsh, no relation in the past. And so I think there's more work to be done on that. Now, you said whoever the author of the Satyricon is, whoever this guy is, most likely a man, because it's not certain that we tend to date the authorship to Nero, the period of Nero with Petronius, but that's not necessarily the case. There have been convincing cases made by classicists. Ulrike Roth is one, trying to say that it's actually an anonymous text that gets a later attribution from the 2nd century. Now, Roth makes that argument by saying that you can see traces in the Satyricon to references in the letters of Pliny. If that's the case, then you have a social network, a literary network of the author of the Satyricon with Pliny, who's in the same family, the Pliny family, well known because of Pliny's letter to Trajan, right? So, and in that group, you have a number of other authors, including Apuleius. You can make that kind of extrapolation of how these people are interacting with one another. So we have that evidence for quote unquote pagan authors. But we don't, because of these artificial divides that we've been referencing in this conversation, don't make the connection to Jewish authors, and we don't make the connection to early Christian authors. Right. So what we have to struggle with, and this is the second piece, is it's quite possible Christianity is being referenced and Christian texts referenced by these quote unquote pagan authors, beyond, again, the explicit references you find in something like Lucian. They're being referenced satirically, or they're being ignored because they think they're ridiculous and just only worthy of sort of blind parody. And, I actually gave a paper earlier this week on this subject and was talking to someone in the English department here at University of Miami. The thing with satire and humor is that you ruin the joke if you over-explain it, right? So we could have multiple references, to early Christian authors and to early Christianity in the form of parody, satire, and even silence in certain cases in the pursuit of a joke. Right?
In fact, in an appendix I have in my book coming up, I have a whole section, 10 pages or so, on Lucian and the importance of satire, because satire requires knowledge of the antecedent text.
Exactly.
And it's not telling you that it's imitating Homer or Euripides or whatever, but the reader knows that story well enough so that it triggers the satire. By the way, two other authors to take seriously in your work. One is Achilles Tatius, who seems to know the Gospel of John, and I can give you some examples of that. Yeah. And another is Nonus of Panopolis, who wrote a paraphrase imitating the Bacchae, but it's a paraphrase of the Gospel of John. And then later he wrote the Dionysiaca, the huge garrulous epic on Dionysus. And there are echoes of the Gospel of John. This has been shown by others, echoes of the Gospel of John. Now, this is 5th century Egypt in poetry. I mean, that's why I think this issue of mimetic chaining, which you would want to say is a part of a readership connection, is an overlooked aspect of our field.
I agree.
Yeah.
All
right. Well, good luck with that project.
I was supposed to produce something on it by early November. So, pray for me, I guess.
Hey, that's the same time Dennis's book is supposed to be released. So
hey,
you can have a joint release. That'll be awesome.
I don't know. I mean, this will just be a draft, but I'm gonna present at a conference. But it's hard to make these arguments from silence, because you do need to convince, you have to bring people along with you to convince them that often, the silence is the thing that you're highlighting, or the satire. But I think an important piece of this is back to these social relationships. I mean, what we know from the work of people like John Kloppenborg is that early Christianity is not being patronized, accepted, and to the extent that we might imagine acceptance by the true elite or native aristocracy of Rome until quite late, to the Severan period is where Kloppenborg places it. So if they're encountering, let's even go back to the idea that something like Mark or the letters of Paul have Stoic influence in them. They may read that kind of Stoicism being expressed by these texts and say, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. And then they parody what they see there. So, what you have with what we might call new movements is often negation, parody, satire, rejection. And so that's a hard thing for us to highlight, I think, through scholarship.
Yeah. Awesome. I mean, this conversation is getting really interesting. And I appreciate you all going into the technical details and stuff. And I just want to make a quick comment. I actually read Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh's publication on the Satirica, or one of them that was published by Cambridge University Press, and it was very interesting. And to make a long story short, I ended up actually composing a little piece called the Satirica, and I shared it with Dennis MacDonald, and he got back with me and he said he liked it. He said it was simple and complex. So I'll have to give that to you, Robyn. Right after our interview, I'll give you the link to my little piece. It's about 30 seconds long. I think you'll really like it. So just want to say that.
My inspired art.
I know. Dedicated to you. All righty. Well, do you guys have any?
I want to make a comment about that.
Go ahead.
I'm a banjo player.
Oh.
And I play in Irish pop groups and bluegrass groups and so on. And for me, my scholarship and my banjo playing are a part of almost seamless. That is, to play a banjo, you have to have technical competence. It's difficult to play. That's true for piano. It's true probably for any instrument. But it also requires art. You can't simply be literal and be a good musician. You have to take your technique and you have to apply it with creativity. And I think my field, I think, has become, so anal and so left brain that it's forgot how to feel literature. It's lost pathos. It's lost imagination and creativity. And I think one of the big challenges we have with our students is to fire up their imaginations and give them worlds of mythology to play with.
Yes. All right. Yeah. Good comments, Dennis. Thank you very much. And what about you, Robyn? Any closing thoughts? Any final
Oh, no,
words?
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I spend a lot of time, I'm not quite sure how to say this, which probably means I shouldn't, but I'll try, which is that I think sometimes we lose the art of writing, even in our academic work, which isn't to say that we should make things obtuse or too flowery, but there's a craft to writing that often in our pursuit, because we are philologians or are trying to function in multiple languages and present research, you want clarity, but there also is an element of art to it, because you are also trying to convince. And I find that part of it really exciting and fun as a challenge.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that I know I'm never content with, and I'll always can try to continue to improve. It may be because I'm married to a poet, which is the case. So I have a good critic at home too, a good editor at home. But I do think it's something that we should all strive for, as well as the art and imagination in our own.
I want to follow up with that. When Homer begins his epics, he invokes his muse, where we get the word music, right? And they are actually singing these songs. These are singers. They are not poets in the way we usually think of it. And when Bob Dylan got the Pulitzer Prize, although he never got there, and described what his work was about, he said he takes inspiration from Homer and the muse, and he listens to his muse in a way of creating music. And he said it explicitly. That's the primary model that he has for understanding. And I think we have to have more music in our writing, Robyn. I think you're right about that.
I agree.
All righty. Well, thank you all for that wonderful discussion. I'm sure this is going to make history, since this is the first time you two have gone at it live. And now, Robyn, now everyone knows your official stance on mythicism. So unfortunately for Dr. Carrier, he can't put you on the checklist of people with a PhD who can say that mythicism is plausible. He's always looking. I told him it was funny because we actually had lunch last Friday at this place called Supper in San Antonio. And I told him about that. He was like, oh, shucks, I'm always looking, because he was kind of bummed down that Dennis kind of changed his position. I mean, he was always against mythicism, but he told me that you gave it maybe like a 10% chance that it was true, and now it's like virtually nothing. And he actually made a post on that on his blog, and it was about me and him, and he just got his machine guns, and he Dennis bought a machine gun, but he bought like a bazooka. It was crazy, but at least I got more popularity, and it was interesting. So yeah, go ahead. You're gonna say something?
Oh, well, the thing is, my personal position on this, being reliant on Paul's own testimony, I just want to be clear that sometimes I'm a little bit picky and choosy about what I decide to believe about Paul. So I should, say that I'm always persuadable, but I think it would be very, very strange to have such a sea change in literature and history without there being some historical figure behind it. So,
and like the things they have to do to get around certain like statements, especially like Paul's statement of the pre-Pauline Creed. It's so early, and it clearly paints Jesus as a historical figure, crucified, died, buried, not in the astral realm, on earth. And it's like, and I think mythicists have to try to get around it and say, oh, well, the pre-Pauline Creed's actually late. It's not early, but it seems to be late. I mean, it seems to be early because he seems to be quoting a tradition that even like atheist scholars have to admit, like, it came about 3 years after the death of Jesus. So, I mean, and it's kind of hard to.
Okay, I'm going to give you a metaphor to think about.
Yeah, go ahead.
I used to teach in Denver, Colorado, and on the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. And on a winter night, the clouds would be so thick and low that you thought you were living in Iowa. But then when the clouds dissipated, you saw this mountain range. Now, here's the challenge. Let's consider the mythic overlay of the Gospels to be the cloud. And scholarly criticism can remove the cloud, but it leaves a mountain range. And here's the application. If one were to take an old copy of an English translation of the Gospel of Luke and omit everything in Luke that you could attribute to Greek mythology, and just be ruthless, just get rid of everything that you think is smells of mythology, you're only getting rid of half of the book. What about parables? What about legal disputes? What about prophecies? What about ethical, the Sermon on the Plain? What about, and one cannot be selective about what evidence about Jesus you think is mythical and which is not. You have to be scientific about it. And that's where I get really impatient with mythicism. And that's why I call it intellectually bankrupt. I think it's bankrupt because it doesn't deal with all the evidence. And if one then takes a look at the much of this stuff in Luke that is left over is more primitive than what he has in his sources, I would say, give me a break, give me a better explanation of where it might come from. So that's my issue. Now, whether Jesus existed or not, I suppose is, I would say, as a historian, I can't be absolutely certain. So I would say it's probably 90% that he did exist. But what one can say is that mythicism cannot explain everything that we find in the gospel tradition or Paul. It just can't, you can't get there.
Yeah, I sign to all of that, because the other thing I just want to say is that sometimes I actually find the question a little boring, which I think will maybe be shocking to some extent, but I'm not quite sure why it matters, which is why I maybe come off as a little bit wishy-washy on the subject sometimes. But I mean, even Paul cared very little about what we would call the historical Jesus. He cares about the resurrected Christ, the Christ Jesus that he's having divination experiences of. And to the extent that I happen to subscribe to the idea that the Gospel of Mark is well informed by the letters of Paul, and if we put Mark in priority, what we call the historical Jesus in many respects, I think, represents Paul, not actually, going back to some origin story about a historical Jesus or historical Christ figure. So to me, the question of did Jesus really exist? I'm not sure what good it does us to ask the question anymore. Really.
Point to make, actually.
Yeah.
That's interesting. All righty, guys. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. And once again, we have the most beautiful Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh and the most beautiful Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald talking today. And you all should check out their online publications. They're very good. I've read some of them, very technical. So only the most learned of people can get the most out of it, which is what I like, because it always makes me think about things. So I appreciate y'all's work and your contributions to this very important topic. All righty. Well, in a couple of minutes, I'll give you all the interview to this, or the link to this interview, and you can all share it around with friends and family and whoever you'd like.
Thank you. Thank you for putting us together. It's wonderful to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Robyn. Yeah, all the best.
Thank you.
All righty.